If I had a dime for every single time somebody asked me which commanders they should focus on during the early game, I would probably have somewhere between $2 and $3 by now. So I wanted to go ahead and make a quick video, just kind of an overview of which commanders I think are strong in the early game and which factions can take advantage of those commanders. I'm not going to be sharing equipment, skill builds, or army compositions just for the sake of time. Let's get started. All right, let's start things off by talking about our Tier 1 commander options for good factions. Do keep in mind that you should play whatever commanders you enjoy playing with. These are just my opinions, and this perspective is based solely on role-playing servers, as I do not have any experience on non-RP servers. We'll start things off with Aoen. She is an excellent choice if you are Rohan, Gondor, or Arnor. Rohan and Gondor having those tier 4 cavalry units, and Arnor having the easiest access to pre-riders. She offers an excellent combination of cavalry buffs. She can make her army stun immune, and then if you pair that with a madness immune horseman's helm, her army is simultaneously stun and madness immune, and she can actually do like some damage on her own if you have the skill points for it. Cleave is not a shabby skill by any means. The Shield Maiden title is also pretty solid as well. Overall, she just has a little bit of everything, and the tier 4 cavalry units in this game tend to be some of the best tier 4 units in the game, so she just pairs super nicely with them. Next up, we have Dwalin. This guy is a jack of all trades. He is fantastic early game, he is fantastic late game, he is good in PvE, good in PvP, and good at farming tiles. Early on, you'll probably want to invest in the musician tree. If you're going to be fighting a lot of evil, the Warrior of the Lonely Mountain title is excellent. This is also fantastic for farming dragons and balrogs because they do burn damage. And then later on for PvP, you have a ton of good damage skills that you can pick up, and this guy can easily break 200,000 commander damage on his own, especially if you have him at a really high level of respect, so that you can take the full top R0, full R3, have at least 2 points here, 1 point in the cleanse, and then put some more points into Longbeard. Overall, a fantastic commander that can do a bit of everything. Finally, for the tier 1s, Haldir is a solid option for Lyndon and Lothlorien. He's pretty good overall if you think that you're going to have access to Eagles, because Beast Training pairs extremely well with Eagles, and his R5 title is excellent for ranged units. This is why he is particularly good as Lothlorien and Lyndon, because he can crank up those T4 units to a crazy extent, making them do absolutely fantastic damage. He also provides stun immunity to his army, which is a very valuable thing to have in a metagame that is dominated by commanders like Gandalf the Gray, Gandalf the White, Gilgalad, Witch King, etc., etc. There's a lot of stuns out there in this game, and having your first 2 rounds, having your army be stun immune during those first 2 rounds is excellent. We'll move things on to tier 2 commanders. The absolute top dog here for taking tiles is Gandalf the Gray. This guy has Convener, one of the most powerful abilities in the game. He can be skilled to fight Witch Kings thanks to High Alert. He brings crowd control in the form of the Wizard title, which lets him stun things on round 1. He also has access to Blindside, which is a 1-point wonder skill. For 1 point every 3rd round, this is a 2-round cooldown, every 3rd round you're going to be stunning something, and he has a solid amount of damage reduction as well. Top it all off, he has a little bit of healing that can help early game sustainability. He's never going to be cranking out 100k plus healing like Galadriel or Arwen, but in the early game, that healing can help you keep your army alive and keep fighting. He is seeing less popularity in PvP these days, in my opinion, just because people have really figured out how to deal with him and how to counter him. However, he is probably, I shouldn't say probably, he is definitely one of the best tile takers in the game, certainly one of the most efficient. Next up, everybody's favorite T2 commander, Theoden. This guy is just like Aoen, except a little bit better. He can't make his army simultaneously stun and madness immune. However, he can give every single unit in his army plus 15 base damage and plus 5 HP, which is absolutely ridiculous. Keep in mind that this guy does require R5 in order to work because the Horsemaster title is so phenomenal. This guy, again, you'll want to use him as Gondor or Rohan or Arnor. I should say that Gandalf the Gray, you can really use him as any faction. He also brings some healing to mounted units and the always amazing Rohirrim title. Next up, I will talk about Arwen. This is somewhat of a hotly contested topic. Some people love her, some people hate her. She has an absolutely ridiculous amount of healing through Undolmiel, Elven Blessing, Cleansing Touch, and Parting Gift. Plus, she has some nice damage reduction in the form of Queen of the Reunited Kingdom. And the half-elven title is actually quite solid these days. She's really good for taking tiles and bossing, in my opinion. Bossing because she can remove debuffs, and a lot of times those bosses do damage via debuffs. And the amount of healing that she can put out is able to keep up with the amount of damage that tiles deal, as tile armies tend to be significantly less efficient than player armies, any kind of army you're going to run into in PvP. So early game, her healing can really carry her. However, once you get into PvP, she can get totally shut down by anti-healing skills, and against good players, their enemy armies are just going to be doing too much damage most of the time for Arwen to keep up. So I do think she's a good season starter, and I think she's quite nice for doing bosses, and even mid to late game sweeping mobs. Once you transition into like a PvP commander to replace her, she can still provide value for you. However, I wouldn't take her all the way to level 50 and PvP with her unless you just have her at like a ridiculously high level of respect. I want to also talk about Gimli. This guy is not a very efficient commander. However, in my opinion, he's one of the strongest PvP commanders right now, and that will likely make him worth leveling up. And this is specifically if you have him at R10 and have his unique item. With Balin's Axe, once he hits 100 focus, he will permanently have Pursuit, which is a fantastic thing to have in the current metagame. Like I was saying, you do need him at R10. He's not a great tile taker. You might want to sweep him, eventually mock battle him up. But I wanted to throw it out there because I do think that leveling him early on into seasons can be fantastic, because two of the best commanders in the game for taking tiles are Gandalf the Gray and Gilgalad, and both of those commanders get pretty hard countered by having Pursuit. So even if he isn't the most efficient, I think that he is very valuable to have in your back pocket if you happen to be fighting early on and are running into Gandalf the Grays and Gilgalads. Rohir is a pretty solid choice. I think overall he's kind of a better Arwen in that he isn't so inept in PvP. He's not quite as efficient for taking tiles and doing bosses as Arwen is. However, he's still pretty darn good at it because he does have access to a pretty respectable amount of healing. But the reason he is way better than Arwen in PvP is because he has access to War Chant, which is a very nice damage buff, and he has access to Loyal Followers, which is another very respectable damage buff as well. So he crutches less on healing, and he has way more offensive firepower than Arwen does. And in this game, doing damage is how you win fights, not healing. And so that's why I think that he is quite a bit better than Arwen, while also being pretty good in the early game. If you happen to be playing Lothlorien, Celeborn can be a fine choice. However, if you're not playing Lothlorien, I would not waste my time on this guy. That's because his R5 title only affects March Wardens, and I could have like a super long essay besides this on why he needs to be played in Lothlorien. However, that isn't in the scope of this video. Basically, it boils down to you really need to have at least 2 Elven backline units, and March Wardens plus Sentinels are perfect for that. That is significantly more effective than March Wardens plus whatever the T2 Elf Archer is. I can't remember the name off the top of my head right now. Moving on to T3 Commanders, I think the ultimate tile taker if you are playing an Elven faction is Gilgalad. This is because Kinglykin is an absolutely absurdly broken title. Maybe the best title in the game, definitely up there. This basically makes your army immune to damage for the first 2 rounds of combat, and surprise, surprise, enemy armies on tiles very rarely pack Pursuit, so you're almost never going to get hard countered. I'm not going to say absolutely never, I'm sure it's possible, but the vast majority of the time, you're not going to have to worry about running into a Theoden with a Night Star, or somebody running a Pursuit Fireworks or anything like that. He also does bring in some crowd control, and at Respect 5, he has a nice combination of Chaotic Retreat, extra attacks for your elves, and a flat damage reduction and HP buff for your elves. Even if you're not playing an Elven faction, he's probably worth leveling up in the early game. If you are playing one of the Elven factions, and you have him at R5, I would certainly have him be my absolute primary commander. And King of Men, I think, is a bit underrated, particularly for the early game. He has a pretty reasonable amount of healing. I think people kind of sleep on the amount of healing that he can put out through Elisar, as well as Elven Blessing. He also has the Leader trait, which makes him very solid in the early game, because right when you hit level 20, you get +5 troop command. And in the early game, that's a huge buff. Going from 20 to 25 command is a much larger percent increase than going from 50 to 55 command. This can help smooth out your early game when it comes to pushing into 130s, 150s, and eventually 200 power tiles. In addition to his healing, he has the option of bringing Exorbitance if you happen to be playing an Elven faction, because their units already do quite a lot of damage. If you're playing like the Dwarves and you just have tanky units, you can probably skip Exorbitance and just start investing into his damage skills. I've been using him as one of my starters this season, and I've been quite pleased with him. I also used him a good bit. I think it was my second season. I used him a good bit, and that's when I kind of started thinking that people are sleeping on his healing. For PvP, once you get up to a very high level, I would just swap to full damage on him, just like tier 2 Aragorn. Maybe you put some extra points into Elisar and Elven Blessing if you have them. However, if you have him at R5, you'll probably just want to put some points into King of Men, at least 1 point into Bloodline. Anyways, I said I was going to talk about skill builds during this, but now I'm talking about skill builds. That's just because King of Men is a really cool commander in my opinion, and I think he is very underrated. Galadriel is not terrible for the early game. I don't think she is S tier for the early game, but I do think she is quite fine. The biggest issue with Galadriel is because of Ring of Water, she pretty much always wants to run a single unit army, and it is just way harder to do that early game because you want to be making constant use of all of your conscription queues, and you're usually fighting to be able to fill up a commander even with 3 different types of units, let alone just being able to dump full points of command of 1 unit onto Galadriel. I do think if you're the Dwarves and you get that really early access to Guardians, she could be pretty fantastic. For Elven factions, I think I would skip her in the early game and maybe level her up a bit later when I could sweep with her and actually run mono stack armies with a tank unit in the front. However, she is a great choice if you think you're going to be fighting against other good factions, because Magical Barrier is phenomenally powerful against good factions, not nearly as good against evil factions. So she's certainly one to keep in mind if you happen to be playing the Dwarves, or if your server looks like it's going to be dominated by good factions. Finally, for the T3s, actually there's 2 more. There's Gandalf the White. I think he is super good because he has very early access to Magical Barrier. He has White Rider, which is fantastic at Respect 5. If you happen to be playing Rohan or Gondor, bonus points for that because Horsemanship is a fantastic skill as well. And like Gandalf the Gray, he brings some crowd control in the form of Wizard. And if you're going to be fighting evil, he can spec into High Alert. So definitely a solid option overall as a commander. And we'll round things off by talking about Thorin. This guy really wants you to be playing the Dwarves. However, you can make use of him in any faction. But King Under the Mountain is very specific to Dwarven units, and King of Durin's Folk is also very specific to Dwarven units. However, this guy can bring some healing in the early game through Revivalist. However, I would not rely on this skill in the long run, as in my opinion, it is not point efficient. Where this guy really excels is all of his stacking buffs for Dwarves. Every time he activates Oaken Shield, his army takes less damage. Every time he activates King Under the Mountain, allied Dwarves' defense increases. And he just has a flat damage reduction for allied Dwarven units. So dwarves, dwarves, dwarves. If you can be running full Dwarven army from the early game, this guy's basically like the dwarf version of Gilgalad. It's basically what I'm trying to say. He has a ton of synergy with dwarves, just like Gilgalad has a ton of synergy with elves. If you're an elven faction, you're going to struggle to take advantage of that early game because the dwarven quarters are the last one that you unlock. However, if you are a dwarven faction, that is absolutely perfect. Alright guys, that's it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it and learned something useful. Catch you in the next one. Phoenix, over and out.